Welcome back. Today we have a very interesting guest, a good friend of mine, Rashid, ex-military, medical field, avid hunter, Muslim. Let's talk about it.
اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم كلا إن الإنسان ليطغى.
Welcome back. Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, man. Alhamdulillah. All right. Well, today we wanted to talk with Brother Rashid, and he's taking some time out of his schedule to do this interview. And so I thought that it'd be a very interesting interview because he has some very diverse attributes is within his life and his career, and his story as to how or what led him to Islam, but then also his interest in things I think would be very very fascinating for this segment. So Rashid, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I'm Rashid, weekly from Kansas, born and raised, local, small town boy. Grew up in Fort Scott, Kansas. Journey to Islam, I would say it started with questioning my Christianity or my background as a Christian. Started asking questions early. Things maybe didn't make as much sense as they should, and went to church with my grandmother, who took my mother to church. We all grew up in the same church. I was in the church so much I didn't even know it had a name. I didn't know that church had a name until I was in high school, but because we always called it, my family just always called it by the Sunday school teacher's name. We just all called it her church, Miss Nelson's church. So that was the church I went to, was Miss Nelson's church.
This was in your high school?
Well, from grade school, we called it Miss Nelson's church, and when I got in high school, I learned the name was actually Mount Olive.
Okay.
So I grew up in a small church, but I always had these questions. So I bounced church to church in middle school, asking the same questions like, how is Jesus who they say he was, and the likes. Early on, I remember sitting at a Nazarene church, and I looked at they had a photo above the table, and it had Jesus on it, and my little mind, at that time, I don't remember what age I was, but my little mind said, well, if that's what Jesus looks like, then his father looks like that, then where do I fit? And that started my more questioning.
Let me ask you this.
Yes.
So when you were in high school, you had these questions. They went on until high school as well. And so, but what other type of things were you into in high school? Were you an athlete?
Yeah.
Okay.
So absolutely. And I was an avid wrestler, played football, running back, pretty good at football, really good at wrestling. I had hoped to go to college for wrestling or football. It didn't happen. And at that same time, kind of the drug trade came into the town, and the allure to that kind of money came into play. And I saw friends and family go that route, and I was honestly fearful of it. I got involved a little bit and saw my own tragedies happening around me, and thought I needed to do something differently. And my cousin actually had joined the army before me, and I thought he was crazy. Like, why would you do that, man? That's nuts. But the more I hung out in the streets with family, and the more crime I started to see and people get injured or killed, I thought, well, I was actually at work at Wendy's, and the Army recruiter was there. I had no football scholarships coming through. and for a whole different reasons. No wrestling scholarships coming through, and I saw this recruiter and I walked by and said, I think you recruited my cousin last year, Doug, and he claimed he remembered, and that started my journey into the military. We sat down that day at lunch, started the process. I believe I was 17. Came home excited. I told my mother, and she thought I was a nut. I said, Mom, we haven't had a war in 30 years. I'll be fine. Yeah, so that's how I started my military journey.
That's a very fascinating, story, and very similar to what we hear in that drugs. I mean, we know that in American culture that drugs is a significant part of the American experience, if you will.
Yeah.
And so, some people are able to escape it, but many people are not. And oftentimes we have family members, if not ourselves, that have been involved in that culture, and it's had the effects of that culture.
Yeah, part of the struggle of the drug trade for me was knowing that I had a lot of family members that were actually using the product, and I couldn't reconcile how I would have customers without having family in the pool, and I couldn't imagine that scenario where that played out ever being beneficial to me, and that's another reason that kept me away from it. Of course, now that I'm Muslim, I know that it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who orchestrated everything, and for whatever reason, I was blessed and benefited to not go that route. That's what happened, and that led me to seeing that recruiter that day, me in a more clear state of mind, after I'd seen a handful of murders, being in a clear state of mind, realizing I didn't want the street life completely, and I approached that army recruiter, and alhamdulillah, I was able to avoid all the pitfalls, not all the pitfalls, but a large amount of the pitfalls to street life by going into the military. And it was there I started meeting other people, and my first experience actually with Islam was I was stationed at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where I just started my combat medic training, and one of the guys in the barracks, he was listening to a cassette, and I asked him what he was listening to, because I was heavily into hip-hop at the time. I asked him what he was listening to, and he said he was listening to a lecture about angels. And I said, what? I said, you're Christian? He said, no, I'm actually a Muslim.
So before this time, had you had any exposure to Islam? I mean, I know you said that you had your doubts about Christianity and that, but had you had any exposure to Islam?
I never had, no exposure whatsoever. Other than I knew what I thought was Islam. I knew of Farrakhan, and I heard some of his lectures, and of course at that moment, they sounded interesting, sounded positive. Of course, I knew who Malcolm X was. I'd read his book, the autobiography, and so I was exposed that manner, but nothing else.
Let me see. Which I think that's very interesting too, because I think that oftentimes, and if you'd like to talk about it, we can, but I think that for many of us, the African American community, that our initial exposure to Islam is through the image of Farrakhan, and then Malcolm X, and I'm sure you probably read the autobiography before you even became Muslim.
Absolutely. Yeah, so, I read had read the autobiography, had read other books about Nat Turner and Marcus Garvey. Of course, not Muslim, but just the whole black culture. Again, going back to my history, the city I grew up in, the town I grew up in, was predominantly white. So I was also looking for something that was culturally identifiable to me. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, especially in the 80s, all of our teen sort of TV shows, we were never represented. 16 Candles, Porky's, all this teenage angst, not one black character. So I was absolutely looking for that. And Mom would bring me to the city just to expose me to black culture a lot, Worlds of Fun, concerts, and the like. But I would have to go back to Fort Scott and be around not anything that looked like us. So I was searching for those identifiers. So I was reading all these books, all these authors, and watching all anything I could find. Again, jumping back forward to the military, that just became more of a focus. And at that, the young man, he gave me that cassette tape that night. And I remember listening to it, and to this day I don't know what it was upon, what Islam was upon, but I remember him talking about the lecturer in my ears talking about the angels, and it all was so weird because it was all so foreign to my Christian background that I remember giving him that cassette back in the morning, and in my brain I said, I will never journey into learning about Islam if this is what this is about. I gave him that cassette back, and I turned away from it completely. Finished my training, and during that basic training, Desert Shield turned into Desert Storm, and we declared war. So our training became a little more intense. So being a combat medic, you kind of assumed you were going to a unit eventually that was going to eventually land in the desert.
So Mom's worst fears came true.
Came absolutely true. And I didn't tell her. Yeah. I mean, she knew that it switched to Desert Storm while I was at basic training, but I didn't tell her when we got to Germany that our unit was preparing to deploy, and some of us were getting shots and some of us were getting orders to go. I never told my mom. I didn't tell her until it was all over and the unit returned. I didn't tell her. And unfortunately, I didn't go see combat, so parts of the unit went and parts of us stayed in Germany and guarded areas while they were there. But it was there in Germany that, again, this is pre-Islam, going out one night with some guys and ran into this guy. His name at the time, everyone called him K-Wise. And we were sitting at a restaurant, pre-club, getting our pre-club nourishment. And he said, yeah, this is why I like Germany. They don't eat a lot of pork here.
They don't or do?
They don't.
Okay.
Now, mind you, the Germans eat a ton of pork. But that's what this young man said. They don't eat a lot of pork. And I said, what, are you Muslim? He said, yeah, I'm Muslim. He was from New York. And by that time, I was listening to all uplifting, what I thought was uplifting hip hop. Most of the artists were 5%ers.
Public Enemy?
Public Enemy, yeah. Poor Righteous Teachers, X-Clan, and the likes. A lot of pro-black and pro what I thought Islam rap was about. And so he and I started talking. I said, man, I'm trying to get down. I want to be Muslim. Long story short on that, he came by. I went to his room. He came to my barracks. We started studying. I changed my name. He gave me a name. He became my enlightener, quote unquote enlightener. He gave me a name, and I wanted an R name because Rakim at the time was my favorite rapper. Okay. So I wanted an R name. So he chose an R name for me. It's so embarrassing, I won't even mention it now. Okay. But that was my name, and I went on this journey of learning Islam, what I thought was Islam. And while he was there, I had mastered all the studies, quote unquote, studies and sciences that he gave me. Well, he moved. He moved to Texas and left me alone in Germany, and I started hitting the bookstore. And anything that said Islam on it, I bought it. I mean, I bought a book called The Life of Muhammad ﷺ by a person named Karen Armstrong, who I believe later I learned was an atheist. She just wrote a historical account of who Muhammad ﷺ was. I read parts of that book, but I bought everything. Anything that said Islam, I bought it. And that was the first time I purchased a Quran. I purchased a translation, Marmaduke Pickthall, in the Old English, ye and yea and thou and things like that. And I read that thing, and I remember as I read that, my top was blown. I was like, man, this is crazy. Every verse I was reading was hitting home. I was writing notes to say this to this person that I love and to remember this for myself and talk to my mom about this. I wrote notes all over that book, even though it was in English. I didn't read Arabic at the time. I wrote notes all through that book. And I was just blown away. I carried it everywhere. Everywhere I went, I kept that book with me. And so, again, part of our unit started to go to the desert. And my part of the unit, we started guarding the families of the people who were already in the desert. And we took a bus ride, about 30 miles, 30-minute, 45-minute bus ride every morning to go guard these families. And I was responsible for being on a school bus full of grade school children. And one of my co-riders, I don't know what he did, but he was a Christian. His name was Stanley Howe. He sat on the bus with me, and we rode every morning, and he would debate with me the difference between Christianity and what I thought was Islam.
So at this point, did you consider yourself Muslim, or you just
I was a 5%er.
Okay.
And I had no idea that there was a difference between the nation, 5%ers, and Islam or Muslim. I thought I was Muslim. But I didn't know anything about the Salah. I didn't know anything about true Islam. Now, after I started buying these books, I started learning about the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu and asking, who is he? Because I hadn't learned this in my studies with my enlightener, K-Wise, who had by then had moved to Texas. So he and I'd written K-Wise a letter. And I asked him, hey, when are we going to learn about the prayer? When are we going to learn about the Quran? When are we going to study about the Prophet Muhammad? 30 plus years, I'm still waiting on his response to that letter. K-Wise never responded to that letter. At which, alhamdulillah, I'm glad he didn't. May Allah guide us all to Islam. I mean. So Stanley and I, we would have these debates. And I was saying this off-the-wall type 5%er mess. And Stanley was the type, natural debater, trained debater actually, had sought out a Muslim under the guise that he was interested in Islam. He was actually just going to study with this person so that then he could come back to me and defeat my arguments. He had no intention of truly learning Islam. Real deceitful approach at the time. But subhanAllah, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, He guides whom He wills. On those visits, Stanley actually became Muslim. Subhanallah. And I remember we were outside one time at work and Stanley came up to me and he said, Assalamu alaikum. And I spun around, I said, Alaikum salam. He said, hey, man, you're not even Muslim. I said, what you talking about? He said, I've been studying with this brother named Lang and I became Muslim. You need to come to the mosque with us. I've been to the mosque a couple of times. And I said, what? He said, yeah, we go every Friday. You should come with us. So the mosque was about 30 miles away in a whole different city. And it was in Heidelberg, Germany. We were stationed in Mannheim. So I arranged for me to go at lunch on Yom Jum'ah, Friday. And we jumped on the train and we went there. And it's the first time I'd ever been in a masjid. And the masjid was predominantly Turkish. There was a handful of Africans, a couple of Germans, Europeans, but the majority were Turkish. It was in an old building. You go, the wudu station was at the bottom floor. You go upstairs for the musalla.
What's the wudu station? What's that?
What? The wudu?
Yeah.
Where you make wudu, where you wash up to pray, where you wash your hands and face and other parts of your body to pray, to purify yourself for the prayer. So that was downstairs, and upstairs was the prayer room. And it's the first time I'd ever been. So, but I had learned about wudu by reading those books. So I went and made a wudu, what I thought was wudu, at least. Went upstairs and sat, and the sermon or the khutbah was in Turkish, the Turkish language. But it was the feeling inside of the musalla for the first time ever being in there. And the aesthetic, no chairs, everyone sitting on the floor, the imam standing in front, and everyone, there were people in business suits, the three of us in our BDUs, our military uniform at the time, brothers who looked by all accounts homeless, and brothers again who were just regular dressed, but no, everyone was sitting together, a suit next to a homeless, whatever. And then we stood up to pray, and everyone prayed together in the same fashion. The imam stood in front of us and led us in the prayer. So I went twice. I went to Jum'ah.
Well, how did you feel about that when you saw that? Because you mentioned a lot of things that are very culturally diverse than what we have in American culture. So how did you feel about that? Worshiping with no chair and all these foreign people and so forth. Talk about that.
Yeah, I was absolutely astonished. The again, the feeling of ease and comfort, the feeling of the outside world didn't exist, and all the turmoil of even getting there, riding the train. I mean, it's not stressful at 19 years old or 20 years old. It's not as stressful as it would be now, but it was still an experience to ride a train for 40 minutes or whatever, an hour, to navigate through the town and to get to the masjid was still an experience. And to have none of that be relevant, and I didn't even understand the language, but I knew the movement of the language and the movement of the Quran when he recited the Quran. The movement in me was humbling, and I knew it was something that drew me back. I knew then that I was coming back the next Friday. And I didn't accept Islam at that moment. Because again, I still thought I was Muslim. I didn't know there was a process to accept Islam. But when I left there, we prayed, and Lang kind of gave the brother Lang kind of gave a general translation, because he had spent several years in Turkey in the military, so he was relatively fluent in the language. So he translated the sermon, and of course, 30 years from ago, I don't remember the translation. But I remember leaving there on fire. I went and then I started reading everything. I had found a book of hadith, a small little thin book of hadith. Then I went and bought a what's the Quran? No.
The name of the Quran.
The translator that was popular back then.
Yusuf Ali.
Yusuf Ali. I bought the Yusuf Ali translation, and I carried that, the big heavy green one. I carried that in my book bag everywhere. And if I stopped somewhere, I read. Even if I was still doing what I wasn't supposed to do, I wasn't Muslim yet. Still reading the Quran, and the book was just moving me and just driving me more to things that it was answering those questions that I had as a Christian. I was finding the answers in the Quran, who Jesus alayhi salam was, and what his relevance was, and what he was not, more importantly, and finding that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is much higher than we had ever placed him as a Christian, and much higher, of course, and existed, unlike the 5%ers in the nation value him as. Finding all of these things, which we know now, the word Tawheed, but I wasn't learning that phrase of Tawheed at the time. So we went back to Jum'ah the next Friday. And it was there after the khutbah, I told Lang I want to become Muslim. And he told the Imam, so the Imam said, or that was actually before. So the Imam waited till after the khutbah, and he asked everyone to stay and invited me up front. And I sat up front and I faced the crowd. And at that time, I'd never seen so many brothers in one area, one place. There's a lot of brothers in that little small room, shoulder to shoulder. And I said the Shahada, or the declaration of faith, in front of them. I remember everything I would say there was a man. He was blind. He sat in front. He started weeping. After every word I said, he would cry more and more. And he was the first one to get up. They helped him up, and he was the first one to come to me. And he grabbed me, and he hugged me, and he kissed me. And I don't know what language he spoke, but he was speaking English, just saying thank you over and over and over. And of course, I didn't know the significance. I felt like I didn't do anything for him, but he just said thank you, thank you, thank you. Years later, that would be something that came back to my memory a lot when I would see someone become Muslim. The gratitude I had to be a witness to it was what he was feeling when I became Muslim, and that was an amazing connection. That day, of course, went in a whirlwind. And,
I think it's very amazing that your story and the fact that first of all you had very little exposure to Islam, like the Muslims themselves played a very small part in you becoming Islam. Yeah, you learned kind of Allah guided him and you into that direction, but a lot of yours was self-study. And then also another thing that was interesting is that of course America is very racialized.
Yeah.
And so race is interwoven within the fabrics of American society. We grow up, everything is white, black, or other, whatever else, whether or not we want to accept it or not. But it sounds like you saw that Islam, some of the questions you had about Christianity were the fact of, why does God look this way? Or,
sure.
And so that gives, a group of people, superiority over another people because God looks like them, right?
Sure.
And so in Islam, of course, God is not a human, right? And so you were able to see, and also with your trip to Germany of all places, a European country, you saw most of the people there were not European in this particular mosque, but they were from all different countries. They all worship the same way and worship the same God, and you able to see that Islam actually transcends any type of racial identity. And so I think that is an amazing transformation that you made in that case.
Yeah, because as I said before, my initial reason for searching for something else was identity driven. I did want something that was black. I did want something that brought me more pride to my African culture. In my room, I had photos of Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X hanging on, and Martin Luther King hanging on my wall prior to Islam, and I had all those books written by black authors in my room. And even after I accepted Islam, there was still a lot of cultural stuff I had to shed because I am from America, and there was definitely a divide between black, white, and I did come from a small majority white town, so my identity as being black African American was still absolutely important to me, and so it did reflect upon how I studied and how I applied those studies. But yeah, in that masjid, I was shown that Islam does indeed transcend, because here's a Turkish man leading the congregation. Here's Africans in their dark Africans, and here's Europeans, and everyone's sitting side by side. And caste and social groups were non-relevant. In a church, obviously the deacons are usually known people. Definitely identified. At least in my church, they had their own seats. They had their own rows, and the pulpit was full of the preacher's people, and the choir was usually select children from those families. And so there was definitely a sense of hierarchy in the church that was not there in the mosque, and hasn't been in a masjid or a mosque that I've been into since. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. So, alhamdulillah, at this point, then you become Muslim. You've had quite a bit of journey there, and you're learning about your faith. You're absorbing it in and learning it. And so, then what happened?
So I was stationed in Germany for probably another year after I became Muslim. at one of our prayer sessions, this group of 2 or 3 guys and one girl showed up at the group meeting. We had a group meeting, I believe, every Saturday, and Sergeant Lang was hosting it, and there were some civilian brothers there and sisters there, and we were studying some books, I don't remember. And this group showed up, and they came in, and we asked them, were they Muslim, and they said, yeah. So they sat down with us, we started studying. When it was time to pray, whatever prayer it was, Dhuhr, Asr, I don't remember. And we stood up to pray, and we got lined up. I noticed the man on my right was from that group. He didn't know how to place his hands. Mm-hmm. And I remember being there when I prayed the first prayer. I prayed at the masjid. So I thought, maybe they're not Muslim, but, whatever. I didn't say anything. So we finished, and I introduced myself, and we got to talking, and I found out they were actually from my home city. They were from Mannheim. They had come to Heidelberg for the class. So I said, I'm in Mannheim. We could sit together. And he mentioned, yeah, we can get together and cipher it. So then I knew he's a 5%er. So I said, yeah, we can cipher for sure. We can get together. And I thought to myself, this would be my first opportunity to talk to 5%ers now that I'm Muslim, and to give them what I know about Islam, as opposed to what I left from the nation or from being a 5%er. So we had arranged to meet, and we were going to meet at the PX, which is like like a small convenience store back in Mannheim. Well, whatever happened, he never showed up, and his friends never showed up, and I never saw them again. One time I was coming out of the PX, and I ran into this young woman that was there, and she saw me, I saw her. I don't remember what we said, but I said, "Oh, you live here too?" And she said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what's up with your guys? We were supposed to meet, and they never met." She said, "I don't know. I just came down there with them." Long story short, her and I started talking about Islam while we were standing there, and I found out she was indeed a 5%er. She came from, I believe, Fort Polk, Louisiana, and she's pretty strong in that 5% stuff. And one of the questions I kept asking her, I said, "But what's the divinity in that? You keep saying that, but where's that at in the Quran? If you were Muslim, like you claim to be Muslim, where's that argument in the Quran?" So every time we would talk, I would see her out, we would talk. I would say, "But where's that in the Quran? What's the divinity in that? Where's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that discussion, in that point, whatever the point may be? Where's Allah in it, and what's the Quran?" My intention was to get this woman to read the Quran. Mm-hmm. I felt like if she read the Quran, she would see what I saw in the Quran. Mm-hmm. Long story short, alhamdulillah, she became Muslim. Mashallah. We got married. That was my first wife. That was my first wife. We had 2 children together, alhamdulillah. We got married young. We were very, very young. New Muslims. A lot of mistakes were made, alhamdulillah. We just grew apart. We didn't have any problems, anything serious. We just grew apart, alhamdulillah. So anyways, that was in Germany, and I started to leave Germany. I went to California. My next duty station, I was stationed at Fort Ord, California. And out there, I continued my journey with Islam. I was still a combat medic. I was in a light infantry unit. Found my local masjid. Now in in California was the first real Ramadan I had. My first Ramadan in Germany was a mess. You didn't know any rules. We were, again, self-taught, reading books. There was another brother who became Muslim as a medic in the barracks with me, a white brother from Tennessee, and we tried to piece together fasting and from reading books, and I mean, it was a nightmare.
So this was in like the 90s, I would imagine.
Early 90s.
Yeah, and so we didn't really, in the United States, we didn't have the concept of like real Islamic scholars or teachers or anything like that could teach the people about Islam properly.
Yeah.
This type of thing. So there's a lot of self-study.
It's a lot of self-study, and then being in Europe and only depending on the bookstore called the Stars and Stripes to bring us English books from that were probably pre-scrubbed by the military before they put them on the bookshelf. So what we got was really dumbed down, was really lesser. So we also got hand-me-down from Lang and some of his friends, hand-me-down copies and copies and copies of other books and things like that. But I did buy Tafsir by Maududi, and I bought
What is tafsir?
yeah, the Tafsir. I forgot what it's called.
I mean, what is tafsir?
Oh, Tafsir, the explanation of the Quran. Yeah, the explanation of the Quran. And I bought the collection of hadith. Hadith are stories of the Prophet ﷺ, what he said, what he did, and what he silently approved of. I bought the collection of Abu Dawood. I bought Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari. And that with the Quran and those three hadith sections became my favorite books. Everything else that I bought from Stars and Stripes, I kind of put aside. I just focused on those three collections and the Quran. And at any given moment in my little backpack, I would have the Quran and maybe one book of hadith with me, and I would travel wherever I would go, and I would sit and I would read. And by this time, I had some non-Muslim friends who would, saw me kind of changing, and some of them left me off, some of them stayed around and was interested, but not necessarily became Muslim. But
so changing in the sense that you were giving up a lot of the habits that you had before.
yeah, or at least trying, at least trying, because I was still greatly influenced by culture, greatly influenced by my surrounding, and I didn't have Muslims around me, and my knowledge was very low, except for what I was reading. But yeah, they still saw a change. They still saw a positive change. At least for me, it was positive. I didn't want to do certain things that we did. My language changed, and the likes. Yeah, so then I got moved to Germany, or moved out of Germany to Fort Ord, California, and that was my first Ramadan around a larger group of Muslims, where I had actually had guidance on what to do, and it was the first time having iftar where I broke my fast in a group setting. Mostly Pakistanis at this mosque in I forget the city's name. I had my nikah, my wedding at that masjid in California, and so my time in California was short. It was really short. I was there for about a year and a half, so it's not a relevance there. But then I moved to Fort Ritchie, Maryland, and that's where I think my Islam kind of took another level.
How is that?
That was the first time I would really establish myself in a masjid as a regular, and the masjid just so happened to have the Imam Talib Abdullah. At that time, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know his significance, but he took me under his wing a bit and taught me how to read the Quran properly. Just being around the brother was beneficial as a young, learning Muslim, hungry for knowledge, to be with him. I didn't know the significance of who he was, but just being around him and him giving lessons at the masjid and talking about Islam and talking about Islam to me personally, I would keep him up so long after Isha, after the last prayer. At times he'd say, "Brother Rashid, go home. Just leave. It's late."
Yeah.
And he had to go to bed. But I would just want to keep him around and just keep asking him questions and taking notes and asking questions. I mean, I stay there till 11, 12 o'clock at night. He would finally tell me to go home. Alhamdulillah. So it was beneficial there. And again, my Islam really increased. But it was also there that the next point, I think, was where I decided, career-wise, it was about time for me to get out of the Army I had no idea what I was going to do. I had no thoughts of civilian life, and I was working at a clinic at the time, and my prior 2 units had been combat arms, so I'd only worked with male soldiers. That's the only thing I taken care of. Now I'm in a community clinic that's taking care of families, family members, and soldiers' wives and their children, and the soldiers themselves for sick call and things like that. So I was learning a lot of different things medically instead of just emergency medicine and combat medicine. I was learning how to treat, how to put a cast on someone's arm. I was learning how to remove sutures, stitches. I was learning what medicine to give for a cold and the likes. So one day, this young girl came in. She's probably 8, 9 years old, and she was having a full-on asthma attack. And Dr. Roselle, he said, give her a breathing. He told me to give her a breathing treatment. And I went to one of my buddies, Jameson, and I said, hey, Jay, I don't know how to. Dr. Roselle wants to give her a breathing treatment. He said, you never gave one before? Mm-hmm. I said, no. So he said, come on, I'll show you. So he grabbed the equipment, grabbed the medicine, and we went into the treatment room. And this little girl, she was holding on to the desk. She was wheezing. Her eyes were big. She was drooling. And Jay set up the nebulizer, and he gave her the first breathing treatment, and she's still in the same state. He added more medicine. He gave her another one. Still no change. He added a third one, and she's looking, it's getting worse. The wheezing's getting louder. Her mother's looking a little more panicked, and the little girl's crying. Give her a third treatment, and as the third treatment took effect, she started taking clear breaths. And after that third treatment, she jumped off the table, hugged her mom, and I said, I don't know what that is, but whatever that is, that's what I want to do.
Awesome. So what we're going to do is, I think that's going to complete our first part of this. Very interesting story. And so we will end this here, and we'll look forward to you catching us on our second part, where we'll continue this journey with Rashid.